have the microphone, this first panel, but we have 3 speakers. The fourth one, Dr. Jasbir Singh, is not here, not coming, and his paper will not be read. So we have 25 minutes for each of our 3 speakers. The first one is going to be given by Skype, and I'll give a 2-minute warning before 20 minutes, and then people will know they've got 2 to 5 or 7 minutes left, and we should have plenty of time for questions that way. The 3 speakers, Dr. Sharanjit Kaur Sandhra. She's a seasonal instructor at Fraser University and UBC, University of British Columbia, and she will be giving a paper by Skype, first of all. Then we have Dr. Michael Hawley, who's a professor of religion at Mount Royal University and the University of Calgary. And finally, Tejpaul Singh Bainiwal, whom we have gotten to know, has his MA already in religious studies and is going for a PhD here at UC Riverside. So first of all, if the technical people can get the Skype going, let's have it. Oh, thank you, Tejpaul.
The floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me okay, Tejpaul?
Yes.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I was telling Michael I'm having major FOMO right now, so fear of missing out for not being in the room with such incredible scholars whom I've had the privilege of either communicating, on social media or in person. I have such deep admiration for you all. My sincere regrets for not being there in person, but I do want to thank Tejpaul and for sure Uncle G for accommodating my request to be there online, and I think part of that accommodation is really important to recognize that not all of us have the capacity to be in international conference spaces and travel, and my responsibilities as a daughter-in-law and a mom and a Sikh academic and scholar just would not allow for me to be there in person with you all. So thank you so much. I know it was difficult to organize and organize these conferences at this scale, but I really, really appreciate it. So hopefully, even though I am there virtually, the transference of ideas and some of the things I'm going to share will still be as though I'm there with you in person. I am going to share a screen because I do have PowerPoint slides. I can't do a presentation without some visuals, so I'm just going to quickly share my slide. And Tejpaul, can you give me a thumbs up if you're okay to see that?
Yep.
Awesome, thank you. Okay. So I'm going to begin. While I was doing my PhD studies at UBC in the Department of History, there was a moment within my first year where I was told that I do not belong in that department and that I should consider doing a master's degree instead, something I already had. At that time, and this remains true today, I was the first Sikh person to be in that department in the PhD program, and then eventually earn the Sikh PhD and to be the first Sikh person to earn a PhD in the Department of History at UBC. I was also a full-time working mother to 2 boys who were 5 and 3 then when I began my PhD, and they'll be turning 12 and 14 this month. In that moment, I wanted a hole in the ground to engulf me because I felt such an incredible feeling of not belonging, a lack of worth and intelligence. Because of that moment, I contemplated leaving the program at UBC. And there were a few reasons why I did not end up leaving the program, one of which included an incredible supervisor and mentor, Dr. Henry Yu, and the other reason I would realize soon after was because of the belonging and historical resistance I learned through my work at the National Historic Site Sikh Temple, or Gurdwara, and Sikh Heritage Museum in Abbotsford, British Columbia. From 2011 to 2022, I had the immense privilege to co-curate, exhibit in, and co-manage the Sikh Heritage Museum, which is a National Historic Site of Canada, and Sikh Temple, which is its official name. This Gurdwara and museum ended up becoming the driving force of my dissertation, but it has also been the experiences I've had over those 10 years of providing educational tours to a broad spectrum of community that shaped and fostered my own experiences of belonging and resistance. It was because of those stories of resistance that I learned and created within the Sikh Heritage Museum that I was able to continue within the program at UBC and eventually finish. And so, for my talk today, I want to share those stories of resistance through the archives, erasure, and storytelling, and share some of the incredible histories of heritage within the Sikh historic site here. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge the lands that I am speaking to you all from. I speak to you from the Selk'namuk territories, the Stolo-speaking people of the upriver dialect of Halkomelem. And I say this as a Sikh settler on these lands, understanding that I too have a deep responsibility and an acknowledgement to work towards decolonization and work in solidarity with the incredible Indigenous communities around us. This past month in Surrey, we re-commemorated the Vaisakhi Nagar Kirtan, and there was some 700,000 people who showed up in Surrey. And before the Nagar Kirtan began, there were two Indigenous elders, a husband and wife, who began the procession. And in that moment, it was a very emotional moment for many of us to see that, because it showed kind of that solidarity, that the Nagar Kirtan itself, this kind of taking over of the streets, couldn't begin with an acknowledgement of whose lands those streets are on and whose lands those businesses are on. And so I too always begin with an acknowledgement of where I am speaking from. In 1909, and around the Fraser Valley region, 35 Sikh men worked on farms in Mission and Maxley. 15 worked at construction sites in Abbotsford, while 160 men worked at mills in Abbotsford, Huntington, and Harrison Mills. Another 40 men found work in the village of Clayburn at the Clayburn Brick Factory. It was in 1908 that approximately 50 local Sikh men made the decision to build a Gurdwara under the auspices and overarching organizational title of the Cause of the One Society. The Gurdwara building project was spearheaded by Sundar Singh Thandi, who along with Arjun Singh purchased a 1-acre property on a prominent hill adjacent to the mill at Mill Lake where they worked. They gathered monies to obtain the permits and designs for a new Gurdwara. Since most of the men involved worked at the Abbotsford Lumber Company mill, they asked their owner, Joseph Ogle Chuthui, if he would consider donating some lumber for the Gurdwara. These men, as well as others who worked on the farms in the area, were told that any lumber they could carry on their backs would be donated by the Chuthui company. Without delving too much into interracial nostalgia or white benevolence, it is still important to acknowledge that all the Sikh men working for the Chuthui family were still paid a fraction of the wage of their white counterpart workers. The Sikh men willingly carried the lumber on their backs up the hill from Mill Lake to the Gurdwara site, a trek of about a 2-kilometer uphill stretch. The Abbotsford Gurdwara, officially named again the Gursikh Temple, was completed in 1911 and opened in the following year. It is the second official Gurdwara built in the Americas, and today, oldest still standing Gurdwara in the entire Western Hemisphere. On February 26, 1912, the Gurdwara was declared open in Abbotsford, and many Sikhs as well as non-Sikhs from throughout British Columbia came to take part in the opening prayers and ceremonies. The Abbotsford Post, our local newspaper, reported on March 1, 1912, that the members of the congregation were, quote, much impressed with the highly intelligent address delivered by priest Sant Tejpaul Singh, who spoke in his native tongue and in English, end quote. Sant Tejpaul Singh was a Harvard-educated philosopher and well-known scholar and activist in the Sikh community with national recognition. The way in which this Gurdwara positions itself is a form of resistance through its location. When choosing the site for the Gurdwara, the early Sikh settlers purposefully chose the highest hill at the time, a position that would mean the Gursikh temple would stand taller than any other building in the Fraser Valley and would be visible for long stretches across the region. Though in outward appearance, the Gurdwara did look like a home, the Nishan Sahib, or symbolic flag, an 80-foot tall wooden pole, became the specific Sikh marker of the Gurdwara, and was indeed a religious gateway to the Guru and the Sikh holy text. The positioning of the Gurdwara and its history is once again a stark reminder of the work also yet to be done towards decolonization and reconciliation. So this work towards reconciliation is acknowledged on site, on the building itself, through a physical marker that is in signage both English and Punjabi that acknowledges the Selk'namuk lands that the Gurdwara is built upon. So the message glued onto the heritage building says, in solidarity, the National Historic Site Gursikh Temple is located on the unceded territory of the Selk'namuk First Nations. We stand in solidarity with the Selk'namuk peoples. We acknowledge the Selk'namuk people's ongoing struggle for self-government and recognition. These lands have been theirs from time immemorial. The statement made accessible through 2 languages to all visitors as the first sign seen before entering the museum space and as a marker etched onto the heritage building with permanence is the first step towards ongoing conversations that need to be facilitated as a process at the Sikh Heritage Museum. The Gurdwara from its inception becomes a powerful message of resistance by expression of faith, of permanency, and belonging through the 3 years of building and completion of physical difference and marking. The Gurdwara is built in North America during the same critical juncture against a backdrop of state-sanctioned and legislated racisms of non-belonging. Its inward and outwardly form, as well as its location, are unique to its space only when compared to other Gurdwaras, and thus offer unique histories of belonging and resistance to racism. Beyond the history of the building itself and the site itself, there are stories of resistance that took place within this building. And those conversations took place within those walls were very multifaceted, and they help us shape the future. So this includes stories during the height of the Ghadar movement, where we have heard through oral histories passed down that Ghadarites coming from the United States would follow the light bulb that was on top the 80-foot wooden Nishan Sahib, the original one, and make their way to this space, this heritage Gurdwara space, to recite poetry and ignite the idea of revolution and resistance. Every time I stop at the Nishan Sahib, which you can see the picture of here, so the left-hand side image is of the wooden stump that remains from the original Nishan Sahib that had a little light bulb on top, and the right-hand side Nishan Sahib was the second one that was installed in 1957, which was metal. So when I give tours of this heritage Gurdwara space, I always pause and stop at this moment in this site. And it doesn't matter who I'm giving a tour to. But when I speak to the Sikh students in particular, and South Asian settlers in particular, I see something happen when I share the story of that Ghadar movement and the story of how the Ghadarites would follow the light bulb on top of this Nishan Sahib and walk their way into the space. Something visceral takes place, and that viscerality is an awareness that this space was a site of resistance, and that Nishan Sahib is a marker of finding that site of resistance. It was a part of an anti-colonial strategizing that this Gurdwara is connected to. It was within the walls of this Gurdwara space that poetry was recited, invoking staunch anti-colonialism and anti-racism, and as Dr. Seema Sohi describes, quote, Gurdwaras of North America during the early decades of the 20th century were critical sites for not only religious worship and refuge from the toils of labor in the agricultural valleys and lumber mills of the Pacific coast, but also of resistance, anti-colonial mobilization, and state surveillance, end quote. The rapid emergence of Sikh Gurdwaras at a time when Sikhs were being told they don't belong in the Canadian state through barriers to migration and the taking away of the vote, for example, reflect a resistance to those narratives of not belonging, but also offer counter-histories to the assumption that racialized migrants to Canada in the 20th century were simply sojourners. In this way, the heritage Gurdwara in Abbotsford, as the second documented official Gurdwara constructed in the North Americas, plays a significant role in Sikh settler discourse around resistance and belonging. There is an affect of resistance forged within the walls of the Sikh Heritage Museum, and that affect of resistance has been shaped both by its history, but also in the historiography in which we cite those histories. So that's why during my PhD research, when I interviewed visitors on site, the word bhavna was repeated several times in my interviews. As an example of some of my visitor responses, they said, quote, because it's made in the Langar Hall, referring to the Sikh Heritage Museum, I really like that because it's like so much was done here. So much happened in the space, and now it's been created into a museum. I really like the location, and I like the space, and how it was utilized to become something so great from so many years ago. Somebody else said, but those emotions, that bhavana should exist inside this space. You should take that feeling out with you when you leave. Somebody else said, well, it definitely made me feel like when someone says, go back to your country, or you're not from here, we've been here for a long time. So it definitely made me feel like this is our place. It's not like we're not from here. Our immigration happened a long time ago. This is our home. Bhavana, in these contexts, and I wish to credit my colleague and friend Dr. Harjit Singh Grewal for reminding me this, means affect. It means an affect that is found through a deep reflection of one's history, an emotional attachment to that history, and a responsibility to move through that history in the present moment and the future. There is a disjunct, however, where the stories of resistance, belonging, and affect is reflected within the Sikh community, as we see with some of those powerful responses I just mentioned, and yet the ways in which Sikh stories about Sikh settlement history in Abbotsford in particular, where the Gurdwara is shaped around erasing many of those stories of resistance. The problem is that capital H history and the related archives we rely on as the official repositories that house those capital H histories relegate these stories of resistance into a non-existent abyss, or otherwise shaped as resilience, or shaped through white nostalgia. There is a fascinating evolution of how nostalgic history in the building of this site has shifted. If you'd asked me even a few years ago, I would have been complicit in the nostalgizing of the narrative of Sikhs who worked for the Chathui family in the Abbotsford Lumber Company. And what a kind, generous display of white solidarity that they had in donating the lumber to help build the Gurdwara that stands today. Memory and erasure in the archive is connected intimately to my local Sikh community histories here in Abbotsford. So on the left-hand side, we have the heritage house preserved in Abbotsford of the pioneering family, the Chathuis, who owned the most prosperous lumber company in the early 20th century, the Abbotsford Lumber Company. We even have a street named after the Chathui family. Almost all the Sikh men who settled and migrated into the Fraser Valley worked for this company. On the right-hand side, we see an article from the Abbotsford Maps-Free Times dated December 3rd, 1925, which discusses Abbotsford's KKK chapter and its first member, the patriarch of the family, being Mr. S.D. Chathui. And the article says, a common oath into a brotherhood of strict relations to cultivate and towards our civil government to practice an honorable clannishness towards each other, to exemplify a practical benevolence, shield the sanctity of the home, the chastity of womanhood, to maintain forever white supremacy, teach and faithfully inculcate a high spiritual philosophy, and through an exalted ritualism, by practical devotion to conserve, protect, and maintain the distinctive institutions, rights, privileges, traditions, and ideals of a pure Britishism. For almost a century, this newspaper clipping, the organization, and the family existed within a particular power structure of memory and history. This family's history was nostalgized, whereas complicating the family's history was not done. It took a movement out of the Black Lives Matter resurgence in June of 2020 for this story to re-emerge, and the conversation in the public sphere to emerge, even though the article had existed for almost a century. The problem was that nobody wrote about it, and preserving a certain image of benevolence in the community took precedence. Here, we have another example of the archive itself, the newspaper, redacting a very important part of BC history around the nativist group called the Native Sons of Canada. On December 1927, the local branch of the Native Sons of Canada approached the District Board of Trade with a proposal to eliminate all Oriental labor at the labor mill. I should say Oriental in quotations. When the management of the mill refused to comply, local activists sent each MP a short pamphlet with these words: British Columbia Forests, a souvenir, with compliments of the Native Sons of Canada. I'm a native of British Columbia, produced to the stage by 65% Oriental labor. These were the words on the pamphlet sent out in 1927, and yet the Abbotsford Maps-Free News redacted the name of the organization in an article 3 years later, dated July 9, 1930, which brags about how that same Abbotsford Lumber Company, the ones who donated the lumber to the Heritage Gurdwara, fired 40 or 50 Oriental, which in this case would have been majority Sikh workers. As noted in the article itself, these Sikh men were employed for 2 or 3 generations within that Abbotsford Lumber Company. The article says, quote, faced with the necessity of curtailing production and laying off a large force of men, the management reciprocated the company's goodwill a week ago by readjusting crews so that few, if any, of the white men would be thrown out of employment. We have in our province 46,000 Orientals who were unfairly competing with white labor, end quote. If one were to go by the newspaper clipping alone, the Native Sons of Canada's role in firing these Sikh workers would not be clear, but it took the work of the Reach Gallery Museum in Abbotsford and its archivist in retracing those histories as well as oral stories that we've been collecting, which helped shed light on the fuller story of what is taking place. The use of the word Oriental as well is particularly powerful connected to Edward Said's explanation on Orientalism, where he argues that, quote, Orientalism is a way of coming to terms with the Orient that is based on the Orient's special place in European Western experience. Orientalism can be discussed and analyzed as the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, making statements about it, authorizing views of it, and as a Western style for dominating, end quote. Indeed, one could argue that in this moment, a cohesive Canadian national identity did not exist, but rather the nation state, and in particular British Columbia, hence the name British Columbia, continue to be tied to and with European concepts of the desirable settler migrant, and thus tied to concepts of Orientalism harbored through European imperialism globally. Beyond this, voyeurism as nostalgia existed, where soon after the Gurdwara officially opened on February 1912, Sikhs from all over British Columbia took part in ceremonies. But a distinct voyeurism, rather than acceptance, seemed to bring the Sikh and non-Sikh communities together. So for example, a local housewife reported her thoughts on, quote, a Hindu cremation, saying, "Our girls rushed home from school with an excited and unusual request. Can we go and see a Hindu being burned?" End quote. She further records, mobs of school children and their wondering parents were in attendance. This voyeurism of wanting to see a, quote, Hindu be burned is particularly sharpened when knowing that for many decades, Sikhs had to secretly cremate family and friends in forested areas because there were no spaces of dignity provided that respected Sikh and Hindu traditional last rites. And so the idea of wonderment around death here, as seen in the news article I just read out, is detached from a recognition of one's humanity. The archive, as we all know, is an archive of privilege, an archive of who had the camera, who had the institutional position, who had the pen, who wrote the words, who published those words, and who continues to recite and cite those words in archives. Michel Rolfe-Trio, in his incredible book, Silencing the Past, Power and Production of History, argues that silence enters the process of historical production at 4 crucial moments. So 1, in the sources, the moment of fact creation. 2, the archives, the moment of fact assembly, so the making of archives. 3, the narratives, the moment of fact retrieval or making narratives. And 4, history, the moment of retrospective significance and the making of history. Therefore, any narrative is a particular bundle of silences. And so in reflecting on some of these archives in relation to Sikh history in Abbotsford, which doesn't even afford these early Sikh settlers a humanity of naming, or even naming the right religion, it is important that the archive be questioned and the 4 processes that Trio discusses be questioned. Always. The questioning and furthering of perspective should not end, and that is what makes the production of history limitless and full of potential to change the now. This quote as well, and this is the book I was referring to, Trio says that what we are observing here is archival power at its strongest. The power to define what is and what is not a serious object of research and therefore of mention. Archives are never neutral, but rather exist to reinforce existing colonial hierarchies as inevitable and natural by classifying some individuals, settlers, as observers and others as observed. And this is an article from Krista McCracken, Challenging Colonial Spaces Reconciliation and Decolonizing Work in Canadian Archives. Any archive, as she says, contains far less than it excludes, and every archive has its own history, one that conditions the ability to interact with it, write from it, and understand the large systems of power, control, and legibility that record-keeping enables. Curating history within the walls of the Sikh Heritage Museum space has been a practice of rewriting those nostalgized histories through a decolonized museum space, one in which I have written elsewhere that our approach is decolonized. Our resistance to racism permeates our work at the Sikh Heritage Museum. We work through the Sikh concept of seva, or selfless service, for our communities. It is truly beautiful that the former space in which a vegetarian communal meal was served for everyone as a form of seva was converted into a museum which engages in a cultural, historical storytelling of seva. This is a decolonized approach. When we have larger museum opening receptions, the entire community and all attendees are invited to the main Darbar Hall, the sacred space, as part of the acknowledgement of the fully functioning Gurdwara that still exists. This is a decolonized approach. Ultimately, my journey over these past few years, whether it be through academia and the discipline of history, and my work at the Sikh Heritage Museum, have been the exact polar and parallel forces that fostered my unbelonging and then belonging. That is why from 2014 to 2022, while I completed my studies, it is the Heritage Gurdwara which had remained at the foremost in my mind. Its resistances have become the resistance through which I see my own stories. And these two pictures that you see, I'm done by the way, are one of our more popular exhibit opening receptions. It was an exhibit we did called We Are Hockey, and it analyzes racism basically within the sport of hockey, but also retelling the historical foundations of where hockey began and all the racialized people who have played in the sport. But on the left-hand side is an image of everybody who showed up to that exhibit launch, and how we always begin with acknowledging the sacred space of where we are standing in before we go downstairs to view the exhibit. And that takes me to the end. Thank you.
Perfect timing. Thank you, Sharanjit. Continuing the theme of the panel, preserving, documenting, and narrating Sikh North American history, Michael Hawley.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. I am actually really kind of excited about being able to do this. I have been working on a project of my own here for about the past 6 or 7 years, and I keep promising that there will be an outcome. I keep promising my dean there will be an outcome, and slowly but surely we're starting to see progress. And I'm excited that I'm able to give you all a little bit of a sneak peek of some of the structure and some of the work that I've been up to over the past several years. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't think they're on. I will try to shout. No, I don't think, because it will run interference.
Use a microphone for this panel. I don't
Talk loud.
Yeah, it'll run interference with Sharon, who's joining us via Zoom, so we'll just project our voices. Apologies.
Fortunately, Michael is pretty audible, I think.
How's that, Philip? That's great. Sharon, am I blowing your hair back? I'm sorry if I'm yelling too loudly for you.
No, I love your voice, Michael.
I'll enjoy that while that lasts. So what I've been working on here is something that I've called the Alberta Sikh History Project. And I'll say a little bit about the naming of it in a little bit. The reason why I became interested in this is I got interested in the diaspora in Canada and the Sikh diaspora in Canada. And I started doing some reading around, and the vast majority of scholarship and the vast majority of work on Sikhs in Canada tended to center around lower mainland British Columbia. Vancouver, Victoria, Abbotsford, sort of the center where Sharon's doing a lot of her work, and that's only natural, of course, because that's tended to be the place where Sikhs landed late 19th, early 20th century. That got me thinking about Alberta and the Alberta case. And for those of you who don't know, Alberta's right next door across the Rocky Mountains from British Columbia. Thinking about Sikh history there. And I started to look for resources and stories about Sikhs in Alberta. And there was very, very, very little written on the Sikhs. There was a series of, I think, 2 or 3 interviews that was done mid-1980s with 2 pioneering families. There were a couple of short sort of overviews of Sikhs in Canada, one of them written by Jasbir Singh. And there were a couple other references to Sikhs in Canada, but very little on Alberta. And I thought that was somewhat strange, that there was this absence of Sikhs in the province where you have 5,000, 6,000 folks of Indian descent on the West Coast. And so I started digging around in the archive a little bit. And it didn't take me very long to discover, not surprisingly of course, a fairly rich archive of Sikhs in the province. I started digging around and I started to find immigration records, marriage certificates, death registrations, numerous thousands of references in newspapers, articles about Sikhs, about Sikhism. And what this turns out is that we have a very, very rich untold story of Sikhs in the province. But there's also another piece to this that really got my attention, and that is some of the oral histories that are told about Sikhs in the province place Sikhs in the province as early as the late 1800s, not the 1900s. The earliest photographic evidence of Sikhs in the province dates from 1903. For those who aren't Canadian in the audience, Alberta became a province in 1905. Sikhs have been in Alberta before Alberta was Alberta, which means this flips this migrant narrative on its head. We can no longer really talk about Sikhs simply as migrants to the province of Alberta. They were here, not here, in Alberta before day one. We have to reframe our narrative, our historical narrative about Sikhs in the provinces. Sikhs are builders, they are founders. They're of course then implicated in the colonial project, but there's a whole history here that can be told. Now, what I've tried to do over the past several years is I've tried to start to tell some of that story, at least from the archival point of view. I can dig around in the archives as much as I would like, and I've spent years doing it, and I have literally thousands of documents that I have yet to post onto this website. I've also been doing interviews, a lot of community presentations, but I've also relied on the community to guide some of the research. One of the interesting approaches that I've used for this project is actually social media, and in particular Facebook. It started off as Facebook would just be a way that I could share some of these really interesting findings that I was discovering in the archives. And as it turns out, Facebook turned into not just a way of disseminating some of this information, but it actually turned out to be a research tool. Because what I would find is people would say, oh, wait a minute, I know that person. Or this was, my great-grandfather's uncle's friend who traveled with him to Vancouver from such and such a place in such and such a year. So it actually became a resource, a tool. And it's at that point where I realized I was not in control of this project anymore. The community was actually helping me and guiding me and leading me. And so it's become a project that is for and designed for academics, but also for Sikhs, not only Sikhs from the province, but Sikhs internationally as well, because it will, part of it, be online, and also for the general public. So to borrow a phrase from Philip yesterday, this is a little bit of a platypus project. It's trying to do a lot of things. One of the things that I think is interesting as well, just sort of reflecting on what Professor Leonard was saying in her talk last night, is this question about whether or not this is really a Punjabi history project or a Sikh history project. The evidence, the data that I've been able to collect is that Sikhs themselves identified very much as Sikhs rather than as Punjabis in early Alberta history. Tejpaul, can you help me change stuff? There we go. Here are some just time for a little bit of show and tell here. Here's a couple of examples quite clearly Sikh identity and Sikh consciousness here. Sharon talked about cremations and the importance of maintaining rituals. This was one of the main ways in which Sikh identity was maintained in Alberta. This comes from a newspaper article. This would be about this is 1918. The second one, irrigated land rents for $12 an acre. This is from a newspaper called the Lethbridge Herald. This dates from, again, 1918. But Sikhs collectively living together, Sikhs maintaining associations with one another, that certainly speaks to a Sikh consciousness and a Sikh subjectivity that they wanted to maintain. But I also found, and this one actually stopped me in my tracks, this is a census from, this is 1921, and I realize you don't have bionic vision, but if you can take a look here under the religion column, whereas most censuses and most folks who would identify as Sikh would have been labeled Hindu, many were labeled Sikh. Here we have a fellow by the name of Narrating Singh, 1921, self-identifying as Singh. That would have taken some persuading. That is intentional. That's very much a self-conscious Sikh identity, 1920s. Right? Actually, I'm sorry, this is the 1911 census. Sorry, so it is that early. So this is why I like to call it very much, it is an Alberta Sikh history project. The other reason why I'm sticking with Sikh rather than Punjabi is that one of the experiences of Sikhs in the province was sometimes to associate with those outside of the Sikh community, some married out. Karen Leonard spoke about Sikh Mexican marriages, Hindu Mexican marriages. We have in Alberta people marrying out as well. But even those who married out, or even those who identify differently in official documents such as marriage registrations, continued their association and affiliation with other Sikhs and Sikh institutions. Could you just flip one more time here? Here, for example, is a marriage certificate. Where am I here? I can't see where I am here. This is a marriage certificate of a fellow by the name of Sohan Singh Buller, one of the pioneering fellows in Alberta. He married an African American, and he himself, on other documents, he kept changing his religious designation. He said that he was Baptist for a while, then he converted to Jehovah's Witnesses. But he continually kept his connection with the Sikh Sangat in Victoria. He was actually the first secretary of the Topaz Gurdwara in Victoria, British Columbia, and he kept his association and his connection with that community, regardless of his religious affiliation on official documents.
His daughter is still around.
And his daughter is still around. Yep, and I've had an opportunity actually to speak with his daughter, who is now well into her 90s as well. Other folks, another fellow by the name of Ram Singh. Ram Singh, again, a very, very early settler in Alberta, came in 1915, died in 1945. He also married out of the community. He married actually twice into the African American community. This is his, I believe, his first marriage certificate, marriage registration. You can see there down near the bottom, go back one page, Paul, sorry. He's listed as Sikh. It's down near the bottom on the left-hand side. If you would like this closer up, I can show you where you can access this in a minute. His next marriage certificate, his religion up near the top is listed as Brahmin, which is very strange. And then on his death registration in 1945, he is listed as Hindu. So where did Ram Singh fall? Regardless of how he identifies or how he was identified on these official records, he nonetheless maintained connections with the Sikh community in Calgary. And he was very closely connected with one of the founding families in Calgary, a family named the Hawley family, who were very devout Sikhs. And you can see at the bottom of Ram Singh's death registration the signature of Jasbir Singh Saini, and listed as friend. And so this is very much a Sikh subjectivity, very much a Sikh consciousness going on in Alberta prior to the 1950s, and it's quite intentional. This is Sohan Singh Buller again. This is his wife, Ephigenia Jones. We were talking earlier about siloed histories and the importance to get out of siloed histories. I think Anith was talking about the importance of Black intersections here. We have that very much in Alberta. This is Sohan Singh Buller and his wife, Ephigenia Jones. They're carrying their eldest daughter in the top right there. This is in Edmonton. Her name is Helen Singh. She was the eldest. But in the bottom is a nice little portrait of Sohan Singh Buller and Ephigenia Jones in Sarhali Kalan in Punjab. They traveled to Punjab in the 1960s. They maintained their connections there, and I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall for that visit. This is very much about connections. It's about connecting communities, but there is something very, very Sikh rather than just something Punjabi going on here, and I wanted to emphasize that. A little bit of theory, I think I just want to say something of here, and then we'll get on to a little bit of show and tell. What I have done is I have used something called grounded theory, and for those of you who work in sociology and anthropology, you'll be very familiar with grounded theory. Grounded theory is essentially a way of studying something whereby you collect the data, you take a look at the data, and you generate a theory from the data, rather than doing it the other way around, where you start with the theory and apply the theory to the data to make sense of the data. So this is actually sort of working backwards. And it is a very sort of cyclical type of process, where you collect data, you draw out themes or ideas or key concepts, you test them out, you keep collecting data until you're not getting any more new results. The stage that I'm at now is I am tentatively at a place where I think I have a framing theory to talk about Sikhs in Alberta. And it's one that goes beyond some of the theories about talking about identity or belonging, migration, inclusion, resilience. All of these sorts of themes have come up in other scholarship. But what seems to underpin all those themes is this idea of presence. An idea of presence. And by presence here, I don't just mean geographical, being there presence. I mean presence as in creating space and place, as someone like Doreen Massey might say. That presence is built through relations, through associations, through memories. Presence is connection. And it's from those connections, from that presence, that we can start to sort of tell the story and let Sikh voices be heard in this particular context. So presence isn't just about sort of representation or visibility. Sasha Sabharwal did a great critique of multiculturalism and liberalism. Presence allows us to sort of talk past some of that. It doesn't necessarily buy into sort of preconceived notions about liberalism and multiculturalism. Presence doesn't silo Sikhs. It allows us to talk about Sikh connections and Sikh associations with other minoritized groups. Sikh Japanese connections, Sikh Chinese connections, Sikh Black connections, Sikh indigenous connections, and we need a lot of work being done on that. So it allows us to talk about how Sikhs made space and made themselves present in Alberta. And I like presence because it's, I think in some ways, really kind of disruptive. In some ways. Kaur and Hutnak talk about diaspora as being inherently disruptive. I think the fact that there is a Sikh presence in the archive disrupts our sort of colonial narratives about the homogenous nature of Canada, the homogenous nature of Alberta, the homogenous nature of nation building and state building. Presence is disruptive. But it also has potential, it has possibilities, it has promise. It has what maybe Parminder Bachu might call jugaad, right? It has this possibility of creativity. And so I'm working right now tentatively with maybe using that idea of presence as sort of a framing interpretive principle for talking about at least Sikhs in Alberta. And hopefully it might be a little bit more generalizable outside of the provincial boundaries. The last thing I just want to say is I also see this project more fully as a form of activism. Certainly there's going to be academic publications coming out of this and journal articles and these sorts of things. Frankly, I don't care about that. And if this is being recorded and my dean is watching, sorry. What I think is much more important is making sure that there is community presence in this project. And by community presence, I'm talking about not just reformulating narratives about migration, narratives about what Sikhs did when they came. And by the way, the evidence entirely derails this idea that Sikhs primarily worked on railroads and farms and lumber. In Alberta, they were entrepreneurs, they were restaurant owners. We have one of the first grocery store owners who was Sikh, who went on to have his private pilot's license. Those worked for Imperial Oil, they were market gardeners, they worked for Medalta Potteries. They did a whole range of things. We have to rethink this narrative. But also what we need to do is we need to intervene in some of our institutions. Educational curriculum. We need to get Sikh history and Sikh presence in the curriculum. We have in Calgary something called Heritage Park, which is essentially celebrating white history, white settlement in Alberta. Heritage Park happens to be on the farm that the first Sikh pioneer in Calgary actually farmed on. Yet no mention of Sikhs at Heritage Park. We need to get this history out there. And I'm actually in the process right now of working with one of the Gurdwaras who are using some of the data and some of the archives that I have found. And the Gurdwara Management Committee and the Sangat have actually purchased at their own expense a very large touch screen display that I'm working with them on to be able to sort of tell the history of that particular Gurdwara. I'm providing the archival documentation. They are helping to actually write the story. So I'm not actually writing the history. They're writing their own history based upon some of the archival finds that I've got. Is there anyone, I've got on there the Sikh History Project website. If you can Google it, like it's online. Yeah. Yeah. So what I've done is, and I've got about 3 minutes left. What I've done is I have actually opened up my website that I've been working on for the past several years. It is far from complete. It's probably only 5% populated. But it is very much a work in progress, but it just gives you a little bit of a sense of how I'm presenting this publicly. Is that it? Yeah, that's it. And you can scroll right up to the top, and is that? No, that looks very odd.
It's very small.
Yeah, it is very small.
You need to zoom in on the screen. If you go into...
No, I'm missing a whole bunch of toolbars up top. Oh, no, there they are. And so what you have, and you're welcome to access this for those of you who do have your laptops here, it's ASH Project, Alberta Sikh History Project.ca. This is sort of the structure for the website, and it's designed to target a number of different groups and a number of different interests. There is on the homepage, you have that top bar. There is something called a series of story maps, which is essentially a timeline, but a more interactive timeline of Sikhs in various locations in the province. There's historical documents, historical data, YouTube links. There's a whole bunch of things on there that people can access, but it's intended for sort of the general public. As we move along across that top toolbar, there's a bunch of things that aren't populated yet, but we have a place for oral histories. There are some transcripts from oral histories that are there just right now as placeholders. I'm sitting on hours and hours of video of interviews that need to get edited, and they will be populated. But right at the very end, there's archival, spatial, and other data. That is really intended for academics who want to see some of the primary Sikh sources, and it is, they're all searchable. And so this is sort of what I've been working on for the past several years, and it's a way to sort of start telling a different story about the Sikhs in a very specific part of Canada, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Wonderful presentations, and now Tejpaul, Bainiwal, you've got your, I don't know the title of your talk, but it will continue to focus on preserving, documenting, and narrating North American Sikh history.
Yes. Thank you, and being on a panel with Sharon and Michael, it's amazing because there's so many overlaps and so many similarities, but then I also have to follow up two individuals who are doing amazing work just north of the border. Because there's so many similarities and overlap, I'll try not to repeat what they said about the process that they went through and the fact that, that no one's documenting their history, no one's really preserving their history. I'll save you guys from that and won't be repeating myself. But one thing that I did want to mention was there was talk about siloed histories. And today I just want to focus and shift it and maybe say siloed scholarship. And really talk about what is the practical application of my scholarship as someone who focuses on Sikhs in the United States. And for that, I also want to share the project that I'm working on to preserve Sikh American history in the United States. Is the Sikh American History Project. And hopefully...
You can do things for everybody else, but not for you.
It'll happen eventually.
Yeah.
I'll continue in the meantime. So the Sikh American History Project is ultimately a project that's dedicated to unearthing, preserving, and promoting the history of Sikhs in the United States. And yesterday there were many presentations, many talks that allowed me to really reflect on the work that we are doing with the Sikh American History Project. For example, Dr. Doris Jacobs had mentioned that there's a need for us to focus more on ethnographic work to really understand the importance of Sikhs in the United States. As I read yesterday during the award ceremony when we were honoring Dr. Pachu, saying that in her latest work, Movers and Makers, Dr. Pachu forcefully argues that the intrinsic Sikh sensibilities of collaboration, of sharing, and of radical generosity, as reflected in egalitarian Sikh institutions, have much in common with the contemporary equalizing movements of open source and licensing technologies, free souls, sharism, crowdsourcing, and the Creative Commons. Historic Sikh traditions are thus absolutely in sync with the currents of our times and catalyze diasporic creativity. So that really spoke to me because the Sikh American History Project is a group of scholars and students and community members who wanted to change the way Sikh American history is understood and bring it from the margins to the mainstream. And that was when I really thought more about the practical application of my research. And how I'm able to utilize my knowledge about Sikh American history. Sorry about that, you guys.
Yeah, I think we need an expert other than Tejpaul.
Apologies, 1 second, everybody.
Tejpaul, whatever you're saying is making absolute sense, even if you don't have PowerPoint.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole population, I mean, so, yeah, exactly.
Okay. So, thank you. So, I want to be able to utilize my knowledge in Sikh American history to impact the community in a way that has not been done yet, as we try to fill a void that is sorely needed amongst the Sikh American community. Dr. Kaur had even mentioned yesterday in her talk that there's many who do not know about Sikhs in the United States, whereas it's a different story in Canada. Even though many more people know about Sikhs in Canada, again, as we heard from Michael and Sharon, there's still so much more that needs to be learned. So I want to begin with a brief story as to the why and what really got me into this work. So about roughly 10 years ago at Stockton Gurdwara, I was at Gatka practice, and the committee uncles there were cleaning the Gurdwara up, and there was a trailer in which that they were just cleaning house and cleaning up the trailer because they wanted to remove the trailer from the Gurdwara property. And they were throwing everything in the trash, and as someone who was a Gatka student in martial arts, loved shastras, I noticed that they threw away a few swords. And again, didn't think much of it, went in and just picked up the swords, and then I was like, free swords in the trash, one man's trash is another man's treasure, right? And it wasn't until I really started focusing on the history of Sikhs in the United States and the history of Stockton Gurdwara when I came across this photo. If you notice the individuals, it's a group of individuals in the front who are wearing European-style swords. Those are the same swords that I dug out of the trash over 10 years ago.
Yeah.
This photo is from 1929. So just to put things into perspective, our community, sad to say that in the United States, there's a lack of digital archives, there's a lack of accessibility. Everything is being destroyed before we get the chance to properly preserve it. Whether it's physical material, such as these swords, or whether it's stories from those who arrived in the early 1900s or those who arrived in the post-1965 immigration era. Those individuals are slowly passing away, but we haven't documented those stories yet. Not much scholarship is written about these individuals because the habit of Sikhs is to put their heads down, work hard, create history, but not document history. So that's the basis of my work and the work of the Sikh American History Project. And again, but as you can see, the far left, for example, when we talk about creating history, we all saw what happened during the farmers' protest. That was history in the making. That was a historic movement. Now, 2 years removed from it, 2 years removed from it, the question is who's going to be controlling the narrative? We were able to get a special issue out from the Sikh Formation about the farmers' protest But again, the grassroots work that was being done, the activism that was being done, are we really documenting and preserving what was happening at the ground level? We weren't. There was many aspects that weren't being preserved. So one thing that we took the initiative to start an online digital archive. It's called Kisani Archives. Again, it still hasn't been published, but we have hundreds and hundreds of documentation, including songs that were released, letters of support written by public officials. So that's a practical application of how we preserve the history and the history that we are currently making. Because history isn't just 100 years ago, 50 years ago. It's also yesterday, it's also today. So the research and preservation that we are doing must be at the same time easily accessible to the public to not only help with non-Sikhs understanding the true history and experience of Sikhs in the United States, but also the experiences of Sikhs in the United States, and also to empower the next generation through the rich history that is largely unknown to many at this point. And accessibility really became a huge issue during the COVID pandemic. So what was one of our quick responses? Once the COVID pandemic hit, I went back home to Stockton, California, and individuals started asking if there was a digital tour available of Stockton Gurdwara. For those who aren't aware, Stockton Gurdwara is the oldest Sikh institution in the United States, and there was not a digital tour available. I don't have the expertise to create a digital tour, nor do I have any expertise in video making, filmmaking, but a quick response because educators needed this at that moment during the COVID pandemic. So very quickly with the research that I had done on Stockton Gurdwara, I created a very short film which is now being used by educators across California, across the United States, in lesson plans and as a virtual tour of Stockton Gurdwara and the history of Sikhs in the United States. Beyond this, again, the practical application, I have this knowledge, but how do we make sure that this scholarship isn't siloed? Again, siloed scholarship, it's to really utilize that understanding and that knowledge that I have gained as a Sikh American historian to conduct public projects where the community can really understand what the history of the Sikhs is in the United States. And there's several means in which we do it through, including, again, unearthing, which is the research component, preserving, which is to preserve for future generations, and then to the promoting aspect in how we promote the history and the experiences of Sikhs in the United States. So some of the recent projects that were completed is the San Joaquin Gurdwara landmark, which we were able to designate the first Gurdwara in Fresno County as a county landmark. And again, when we look at that history, it's something that was mentioned again by Sharon and Michael. It wasn't known. Back in 2017, someone had just mentioned that there's a very old Gurdwara in Fresno. All of the Fresno pioneers used to attend that Gurdwara, but since the community has expanded, they're not laborers anymore. They've moved out of this small labor town of San Joaquin and into the city of Fresno, and the Gurdwara is being forgotten. And this individual that I was speaking to, he was one of the founders, and he wished that individuals would just recognize that history and understand the importance of that Gurdwara. So this led to a discussion about how can we really preserve that space. And it was through designating it as a historical landmark. But throughout the process, I conducted research for several years trying to find and dig through the archives, see what was out there. There was nothing out there. Because again, Sikhs are busy putting their heads down, working hard, making a living for their families, and not preserving the history that they are making. So what happened was I conducted several oral history interviews with these individuals, the pioneers in Fresno County, and we were able to have a conversation and really create the narrative of what the history was of these laborers who came in the 60s and in the 70s to Fresno. And we were able to designate it as a Fresno County landmark. Another recent project is consistent presentations at Gurdwaras, student conferences, and public events. For example, we've been invited to speak at various Gurdwaras, at various university campuses, but also public events. For example, the Sacramento Kings held Sikh American Heritage Night, in which we were invited to have a museum exhibit for the public audience. What is the purpose of our scholarship if we're not sharing it with the broader public? So taking that into consideration, we're creating a network in which we can create these public-facing projects and present the work, present the research to the masses. And also, Michael just mentioned about the need to create Sikh history and Sikh presence in curriculum. Again, it was a huge issue that we found here in the United States as well. Quickly, with a show of hands, how many folks are products of the U.S. public education system? Show of hands if throughout your education, you've learned anything about Sikhs in your K through 12 education. Nope.
Everybody is raising their hands. I'm just joking.
No. So, and that speaks volume. We had one person raise their hand, so thank you. I'm gonna call on you real quick. How much did you learn about Sikhs in your?
I think we had maybe 1 or 2 days in my AP Geo class on Sikhism.
That's
What school did you go to?
I went to Antelope High School. Teacher's name is Mr. Tromberg, great guy.
I was wondering if the teacher was a South Asian.
No, so
He's like
that's amazing. 1 to 2 days. Again, that's practically unheard of. You saw how many people raised their hands, and then how many quickly put them down. I had the luxury of learning about Sikhs for a whole 1 sentence, and that too, the sentence was just to talk about 1984 and how Sikh bodyguards assassinated Indira Gandhi. Not even providing context, but that's the only thing we learned about Sikhs in the public education system, despite the fact that I went to school right down the street from Stockton Gurdwara. So, understanding this need, we began working on curriculum with educators across California, across the US actually. The first one that we did was, again, my hometown, Stockton Unified School District, and we were able to work on their ethnic studies curriculum. As folks may be familiar, California became the first state to make ethnic studies a mandatory requirement in 2021 for high school students. The mandate will start taking effect with the graduating class of 2029 and 2030. However, students in high school must start taking courses in the 2025-2026 academic school year. So we're roughly 2 years out. But the grassroots advocacy for establishing ethnic studies as a high school requirement started many years before. Sikh American organizations were involved in the movement as they advocated to include Sikh American history and experiences as part of the ethnic studies curriculum. In August 2020, the California Department of Education's Instructional Quality Commission had a meeting to discuss the ethnic studies model curriculum, in which I had the opportunity to testify in front of the commission to help them understand the importance of the Sikh American narrative and how it has been constantly undervalued and ignored in the fields of history and ethnic studies here in the United States. Though successful in advocating for inclusion in California curriculum, Sikh American organizations don't have that background to provide the content. So these same Sikh American organizations were relying on me, would reach out to me and ask me to create the curriculum. And that also led to the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. We were contracted to create a lesson plan on the history of Sikhs and Sikh American history and the experiences for grades 8 through 12. And it's near ready to launch in Wisconsin and nationally really soon.
The foundation was opposing it.
I'm glad you mentioned it. I almost let that slide. But again, if we don't control the narrative, if we're not the ones who are writing the application or the curricula, who's going to? Hindu American Foundation, I forget the year, but I believe it was 2015, they actually sought to remove Sikhs from the curricula and from K through 12 education here in the United States. And if we don't get involved in there's many people who ask me, why now? Tejpaul, why don't you just wait until you finish your PhD? And I know Michael made the comment that, his dean and he doesn't care. I have my advisor sitting right in front of me, so it's much tougher for me to say this. But I understand. I will finish my PhD. But the need is now. Again, if we don't get involved now at the grassroots level, the push to advocate and create the ethnic studies curricula, as I mentioned, they're creating the Liberated Ethnic Studies Group is a group of educators from K through 12, even Asian American Studies scholars, who are trying to create a model ethnic studies curriculum that will be implemented in 2025, 2026. And we're in connection with them trying to establish lesson plans on Sikh American history. Because if we don't get involved now, then we'll be trying to catch up with them and spend years and years of advocacy along with so much money on advocacy just to catch up, rather than being involved at the ground level now and really controlling and being the ones that are writing the narrative and controlling the narrative of Sikh Americans. Other public projects, again, is museum exhibits. One recent museum exhibit that we had, you can see, is at UOP, University of Pacific, also in Stockton. As you can tell, I'm very Stockton focused right now because it's home to me. And it's where it's where Sikh history started. And we had this just last month, but again, it's not just a one-time thing. This has now become a model. This digital museum, this digital exhibit, has now become a model that can be utilized at other campuses as well. Moving on, other projects that are near the first phase of completion, again, the main purpose is the benefit of the community. What's much more important than scholarship is the community presence and the need to get the history out there, as mentioned by Michael. Again, as was mentioned, we were able to successfully establish the first Gurdwara in Fresno County as a county landmark. Just Thursday, we had a meeting at LA City Hall to designate Vermont Gurdwara, the first Gurdwara in LA County, as a Los Angeles Cultural and Heritage Monument, which would make it only the fourth Sikh institution to be recognized by a city to be a historic landmark. We were successful, and the commission thought it was a home run, but it's still in the works. Another one is a museum exhibit called Sikh Americans, Faith, Resilience, and Power, which will begin to be displayed at the San Joaquin County Museum. It's a portion of the project which will be done in partnership with and with financial assistance with the San Joaquin County Historical Museum and Stockton Gurdwara. And it was meant to be also featured at the Smithsonian Folklife Festival in June 2023, but for some personal reasons, we have to shift it back a little bit, and we won't be able to present it at the Smithsonian. But again, it was also being recognized by the Smithsonian for this huge festival in June. But this festival, despite the historical exhibit not being present at the festival, we were still able to organize multiple sessions as part of the Living Religion Creative Encounters in the U.S. theme as part of the main exhibition, which focused on the exhibits and the sessions that we organized are surrounding Kirtan, history lectures, and Lunga. Number 4 is accessible education. We're also working and near completion for an interactive learning platform. It's an opportunity for individuals to learn what the history is, those in K through 12, even in undergraduate, to learn what the history is and really have discussion about it. So what it looks like is, so again, we provide individuals with real life situations that these early immigrants faced, and they're given different scenarios based off of historical facts. And it's on them to make the decisions that these early Sikh pioneers had to make when they first arrived. Rather than sitting back and us judging them why they made these certain decisions, we're putting these students and educators in their shoes and trying to see what decisions they make. So this is one of our other public-facing projects. And then also preserving local history. We worked with the local Sangat in Colorado and History Colorado. We actually received a grant through the Colorado State Historical Fund of nearly $50,000 to preserve the history of Sikhs in Colorado. Again, when we think about the history of Sikhs in the United States, it's a West Coast narrative. We think about Oregon, Washington, California. Sikhs have been in Colorado since the 1920s. No one talks about that. No one is aware of that. When I gave a presentation about the history of Sikhs in Colorado, I was in a room full of Colorado historians, educators, and none of them were aware of this history. They weren't even aware there was a presence of Sikhs in Colorado. Again, the scholarship that we are doing, what good does it do if it's not reaching the public and it's not reaching the masses? We need to shift this siloed scholarship and make it more public scholarship. And finally, one of the other projects near completion is SSA and student trainings to really save Sikh American history. And a huge shout out to Saldef and Kiran, again, for really providing us with the platform to share this project and the effort that we're doing with the next generation so they can really get involved and understand what the importance is to preserve our history and what's the accurate way we can really tell our own narrative and reclaim our narrative. Other works in progress. Some are in the development phase, some are further along than others. But again, developing more K-12 curriculum on Sikh American history to fulfill the Asian American and ethnic studies mandates that are being swept throughout the United States. We're working with the Asian American Education Project to develop more lesson plans along with SALDEF. And again, the community in Stockton wanted to create a short documentary about the history of Stockton Gurdwara to allow the broader public, not just non-Sikhs, but also the Sikhs, because there are many Sikhs who aren't aware of the history, to really understand the history of Sikhs in the United States. And then we have our People, Places, and Events, which is a digital encyclopedia of Sikh American history. And our People, Places, and Events won't get too much into it because take what Michael's doing and everything Michael presented, but just bring it south of the border. So it's a digital encyclopedia of Sikh American history. It's an online database, an archive of not only documents, but also oral histories. And then, oral history archive, so which will be in the People, Places, and Events. But as mentioned, we're not documenting our history. We're constantly creating history. For example, Manpreet Kaur, who was supposed to be presenting later today, became the first Punjabi Sikh woman to become a council member in the city of Bakersfield. That's history in the making. How do we remember that narrative and how is it being told? Same thing with just Meet Vance, who became the first Sikh in the California State Assembly. Once again, history in the making. But how are we preserving this history to share with future generations? How is it going to be remembered 50 years from now, 100 years from now? And again, this is a lot of work, so it's not just one individual who can do it. Again, we're trying to establish a network of scholars. The paper that I read yesterday of Amrit Deol is also on our team and helping out with this project. We also have Navdeep Singh, who will be presenting later on as well. So just to finish off, because I feel like I'm running out of time, again, the purpose is siloed scholarship. If we're presenting and we're doing all of this research, but it's not reaching the masses, and if we're not understanding that the time is now. The train has already left for ethnic studies in California. Illinois is passing it. There's talks in New Jersey, or New Jersey already passed it. Kiran and Navdeep can tell you more about that because they're doing the advocacy work. But again, as a scholar on Sikh American history, and same thing with Amrit Deol, it's our responsibility to then share this work with the public and make sure that we are controlling that narrative and we are in at the ground level before we end up, trying to catch up to the work that is being done. So again, as mentioned, the work continues and there's a lot to be done. To connect with the Sikh American History Project and our social media pages, you can see them there. I will have to admit though, social media is not our strength, but it's a work in progress. Again, we get so caught up on the actual work. As you saw, there's so much work to be done. For me, my philosophy is people will find out, but the work needs to be done. So again, I always used to just ignore social media, but I was told that no, people need to find out as the work is being done as well. So again, if you guys have any questions, happy to answer. And again, to stay in touch with the History Project, those are our social media handles. And thank you.
Three really strong presentations and in a timely way, and we have plenty of time for questions. And is Sharanjit is still there? Is she? Okay, well, let's have hands up. First, Opinderji. Well, let's take them one by one because we have plenty of time.
So thank you to both of you. They were really interesting. Tejpaul, I absolutely love your enthusiasm, your passion to take your work beyond academia. So, at the moment there's this big emphasis, I don't know if that's here in America, but back home, a huge emphasis that the money that we get for research projects, the time we spend on work, it must be good value for publicly funded money. So in that respect, kind of engaging with community groups, etc., is very important. You made a point about social media. What I would say to you is social media is absolutely essential. My first question is, why was there this objection? What was the justification for the objection from the Hindu Foundation? And then secondly, have you actually approached high net individuals around this region to help you mobilise some of that history project, some of that archival projects that you talked about?
For the Hindu American Foundation and what they have, I feel as if I may not be the best person in this room because there are folks who are actually involved in the process. And I know Navdeep was one, so he can actually, if you want to just...
Yeah, so the Hindu American Foundation, for those who aren't aware, it's a, frankly, it is an organization with strong ties to the BJP and RSS, funded by high caste privilege Hindus who, frankly, when we were pushing Sikh Studies as part of the religion curriculum and as part of the ethnic studies curriculum, objected to a couple things. First was, they said any mentions of caste are anti-Hindu. And it's Hindu phobia, and we're currently seeing death threats that activists in this space are subjected to. Our organization has received a lot of threats. Second is, frankly, at the fundamental core, Sikhi does not exist. Sikhi is an outgrowth of Vedantic philosophy. Sikhs are Hindus. That's the end goal there. We do not exist as a people. We are just another population to be controlled. Which is their narrative. And they have and that's part of the challenge here from the advocacy side, and why it ties so much into the history and the scholarship, is the question of our own identity's existence is being erased by very actively and a concerted global effort by others.
Wow.
And also, just to add to that, again, in that one paragraph, there was one sentence about Sikhs in 1984 about the assassination of Indira Gandhi, but later on it also briefly mentions that Sikhs are a offshoot of Hinduism, and Sikhs are Hindus. So, again, that's the narrative that we need to combat, and this is the narrative that was being shared in public schools here in California, at least.
Amritjeet? Who's next? I think Lou was first.
Oh, was I?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then
So I was trying to get you, sorry.
Okay.
Well, I was just going by what she is doing. The chair.
Hello, 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 hello.
Oh. Yeah, they're not on.
Hey. Wow.
I don't think it's on.
It's not. I
It's
don't
not.
think it is either.
The placebo.
It says it's on.
Okay,
Well-
it was just turned off then.
Okay, sorry. All right. You know what? Am I projecting loudly enough? Can you all hear me?
Okay, now he's getting it.
Okay.
Get it recorded.
All right. Sorry. I have so many questions about so many issues. I loved every presentation, as most people here did. One question in particular that is niggling at me was that census report from 1911 that he labeled himself Singh. This is astounding to me. It's absolutely astounding. I have not seen that this early. Now, this is a time, of course, when there are issues, and there are Sikhs who are discussing whether or not to label themselves as Sikh or Singh. We can find that in the Khalsa Advocate and the Khalsa Samachar and so on. So do you have any more background on that? Was this dude influenced, perhaps? It's just so out there for me.
I mean, as soon as I saw that, I had to, because you spend a lot of time looking at census stuff and you don't trust your eyes. And I kept reading Sikh, but no, it's Singh. I know very, very little about this fellow. His name is Narrating Singh. He arrived probably in about 1905 into Canada. Was in Alberta in 1908. He likely traveled with a fellow that he met on the journey over to Canada by the name of Tejpaul Singh, and he and Tejpaul Singh together farmed in adjacent lots out in the middle of nowhere in Alberta. On his homestead preemption certificate that he signed in Calgary in September 27th, 1908. How's that for OCD? He lists his place of residence as Calcutta, which may be just the port that he left from. Tejpaul Singh lists his place of residence as Lahore. So how they met, when they met, we're not sure. A year after homesteading, Tejpaul Singh passed from pulmonary tuberculosis. Narrating Singh, our friend who lists himself as Singh, made a court application to take over his friend's homestead, which was denied, and Tejpaul Singh's land was sold to a white fellow who paid $100 for the land. Narrating Singh disappears, likely out of the archive. And one of the things about dealing with this material and the motivations as to why someone identifies a particular way is we have very, very little to go on. There's so many fleeting, ephemeral, single-time references to Sikhs in the province. I remember speaking with Sharon and saying we, in a sense, have an opposite problem in Vancouver versus in Alberta. Whereas in Vancouver, there's a lot of information, a lot of photographs, but there's no names to the photographs. As a matter of fact, there's a group in Vancouver called the Nameless Collective, trying to assign this sort of thing. I have the opposite problem. I have the Faceless Collective. I have a lot of names, but no faces and no stories. So I'm sorry, that's all I've got is a thing.
Great.
Yeah.
It's a great little fact.
Amritjeet and then Kathleen.
Thank you. Like Lou, I feel there are just so many questions. First of all, I want to supplement what Navjeet said about the Hindu American Foundation. Two quick things. One, what kind of Navjeet said, but it needs to be amplified. The Hindu American Foundation started doing this stuff long before Modi came into power. So, and then there is, if some of you know Ekal Vidyalaya, they have collected millions of dollars pretending to do early child education, but it's actually a VHP organization. So they have been operating here. But there's another element in this. They also opposed any mention of caste and any mention of no rights for women under Manusmriti and, so on.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I was, Michael, amazing work. Grounded theory sounds so good. I've been doing it all my life without knowing the name for doing it. But I was wondering, the two, Ram Singh and Son Singh particularly, here are Sikhs who long time ago were able to overcome the Desi anti-black prejudice. That still is a major part of our community, not just the Sikh community, but the Desi community at large. Some South Asians are much worse than whites in their prejudice against blacks. So I wonder if you had any reflection on how these two individuals. Let me finish. All the three papers were excellent. By the way, on the farmer movement, there are two documentaries already. Yeah. One of them is by Nishta Jain. Then I was also wondering what you make of the work being done by SADA, because they are doing some of that work. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it at that.
Any response, Michael?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, just in terms of the Black-Sikh relationships and solidarities, I'm hesitant to read into that archive the ability to overcome those prejudices. And the reason for this is we're not sure how either community, the Sikh community was very, very small at the time, but certainly we're not sure how the black community responded to that sort of association. Those sorts of marriages, of course, made sense from the perspective that both communities visible minority, both communities very much the subject of racism, discrimination, particularly in Alberta against the black community, the Sikh community less so just because their numbers were so small. They did not face that overt moral panic that you were getting in places like Vancouver. Nonetheless, there absolutely was discrimination that was taking place, just not at that heightened level. Both groups have a history of slavery, exclusion, colonialism. So those sorts of partnerships probably were good fits, if you will, at the time. They had a lot. The two groups had a lot in common.
Must have been very small too.
But
Black presence in Canada even today,
yeah,
except for new immigrants.
Yeah, reasonably small. But in Alberta, there was a public outcry because there were invitations to come and settle in Alberta, sort of the limited price land for limited prices for homesteads, this sort of thing. And we have in 1908, 1909, many black migrants coming up from Oklahoma that caused a great deal of panic in Alberta, particularly among various business groups and chambers of commerce. But that overcoming that sort of animosity that you referenced didn't go away. Sohan Singh Buller has a park named after him in Edmonton. And I had the opportunity to speak with a number of his descendants, and it was controversial, to say the least, about who would attend and who would not attend and who would represent which side of the family and who should be invited or not, precisely along those lines. So I'm not entirely sure they were able to overcome those barriers.
Yeah, and then
Oh,
to address you, it was two. Yes, it was one about the documentaries and then about Sada. So first, speaking to the documentaries, we must understand that the creators of these documentaries, when they have a specific vision and a specific narrative that they want to share when creating the documentary, which will naturally remove certain aspects of the farmers' protest that will be left out because there's only so much you can put into a documentary. We're more concerned about the raw documents, so scholars, filmmakers, and others who want to utilize this for different projects,
Archive.
15, 20, exactly, an archive. Because that can be utilized even 20, 30 years from now, whereas this documentary will only tell a specific narrative that these filmmakers wanted to tell. And then Sada's a partner. Again, the category of South Asian is so broad that they only have so much capacity. And to expect them to adequately represent all South Asians is kind of ridiculous, given how many South Asians and how diverse South Asians are. And quite frankly, when we launched the Sikh American History Project, that's exactly the conversation that we had with SADA founders. We had a very early on conversation, and again, as I mentioned, now they're partners of ours.
Excuse me, I'm so sorry.
Here.
Yeah,
Sharon is still.
yeah.
Please.
I just want to mention, Tejpaul, I really appreciated your reference to the farmers' protest. And at the South Asian Studies Institute, we've done a film documentary called Rail, Jails, and Trolleys, which is currently in the film festival circuit taking place right now. So it's not publicly available, but you can certainly request to host a screening. And the BC context of the farmers' protest and that film addresses the Khalistan movement and Mo Dhaliwal and the toolkit scandal. And because Mo, I'm lucky enough to call a dear friend, and he went through hell because of this whole toolkit thing. And that film does such an impeccable job of everything, Tejpaul, you were saying about, the grassroots kind of ground level up conversations, as difficult as they are, taking place, as well as what took place during the farmers' protest in connection to Sikh concepts of seva and langar and education and all these concepts. So That work too is being done. So it's called Rails, Jails, and Trolleys. And if you are interested in screening it in the States, maybe email me, and I can certainly coordinate with Sublinder, who is the person who made that film.
And I just want to add one more thing, sorry, about the farmers' protest and the diversity of the stories that are there. Again, if we just read the Sikh Formation special issue, all the pieces that are in there are coming at it from a different angle. And again, there's so many angles that were still missed in that special issue. So again, it's more about the archive rather than these documentaries.
Yes. I think this is simply a wonderful panel.
Oh, sorry, Parminder.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think it's a simply wonderful panel. You know, one of the things that, I mean, it's not, you know, going beyond the US, the narrative of people who've done a great deal in many contexts. Like, for example, Makhan Singh in Kenya, the trade unionist who went to jail longer than Jomo Kenyatta, is the person. I mean, the statement could be, without Makhan Singh, African independence in almost every country would not have been possible. Yet this narrative simply does not exist. He went to jail longer than Kenyatta. He's the one who gives the decolonization movement its slogan, Uhuru Sasa. You know, they were all over the place. He concretizes it. His father has a printing press and is being graded by the British all the time. But the narrative gets controlled by the British, and Kenyatta did not want to organize this because the narrative was that Indians exploited Africans. But never the case that the British owned the most fertile land. They conquered, they colonized. Indian presence in East Africa, all of the coast of the east coast of Africa, is ancient, 9 BC or something like that. The rupee was the currency, etc., of that country. And so the point being that there are all these power structures you have to negotiate. I mean, it's very difficult. Similarly, the Brahmin story is very difficult for people who've done a great deal, where when the country becomes independent, they don't want that to be talked about. You know, Makhan Singh was completely erased. And he's the one who tells them how to organize against the British. He's also part of the Gadda movement. And so on and so forth. And similarly, we are told Columbus, not Vasco da Gama, went to India, discovered the spice route. The point is, he went to East Africa, and that route was very well known to ancient Gujarati traders, and somebody took him there, and so on and so forth. And I think that this notion that Sikhs were Hindus is also a very old narrative for the Sikhs, right from the beginning. They did not like the egalitarian ethos and really did not want this to happen. And then, wasn't it Khan Singh Nabha who wrote this book, Hum Hindu Nahi Hain? I mean, there's a constant, Arya Samaj, in many places, always trying to undermine the Sikhs, so I think that this is really interesting. And I have had a personal experience where I'm presenting this movers and makers work, where I'm saying this is, egalitarian, it's collaborative. And I'm referring to Ajanta Subramaniam's work, The Merit of Caste and the Caste of Merit. It's about Tamil Brahmins and how they dominate the IITs and so on and so forth. I'm referring to her work, but some Brahmin in the audience really wants me to shut up, because power works in these ways that you don't want people to be, it's sort of invisibilized, that you don't want emphasis on your Brahminness. So an academic referring to somebody else's work, only Ajanta Subramaniam can speak about the exclusivity of that caste. They don't even want, in an academic discourse, somebody else referring to what is already in the public discourse. Book published by Harvard University Press, and so I think documenting the past is really, really important and very hard to do. We need huge personnel. We need media people, all kinds of.
Thank you, Parminder. Tavleen?
Is that actually on? Oh, it's going back that way? Yeah. So my question is actually for Sharanjit and Tejpaul, for the both of you. Should I come up there for the question for Sharanjit, or can you hear me okay?
I cannot.
No.
She cannot hear you.
Should I come up there?
Repeat the question then, maybe?
I'll just go up there.
Okay.
Thank you. I don't know where to look. I'll just look everywhere. Hi, Sharanjit. Thank you for your really wonderful talk. And my question for the both of you is, if you could add more about how Gurdwara are more than just Gurdwara. Also, because if we look at examples of El Centro and other like newer Fresno, Doctoral Gurdwara, they've become places that people set up like polls for voting season, and they've become places where flood relief efforts are collected and this and that. If that ties into the narratives of how you're framing oral histories and what Gurdwaras have come to represent, and also undocumented migrants when they're released from ICE detention, one of the first places they go to is Gurdwara, and the El Centro Gurdwara being like 5 miles from one of the biggest detention centers in this region. I'm just wondering about those connections, and I think there's some parallels to Canada as well in that. So, anyways.
Thank you. It's morbid not being able to see people. Like, I don't think that people can see me, but I really appreciated that question. I actually was thinking about that idea when Michael was speaking about the idea of presence, right? And how do we kind of subvert looking only to official census and government data collections around the Sikh presence and the Sikh self idea of presence as well. And to me, I look to Gurdwaras for that answer in part as well, right? Like, before, like, ways of writing about Sikh histories has always been this idea of sojourner status. And every time I read this in you know, historians from the past saying sojourner, it rubbed me the wrong way. And I realized it rubbed me the wrong way because it just kind of inferred that they were here to earn, make money, and go back home. And I felt that that's not accurate. That's not the full story. And for me, the Gurdwaras are an example of that. So the heritage Gurdwara that I've had the privilege of working in is the oldest still standing documented Gurdwara. But let's talk about the undocumented ones, right? So Golden, BC, which is up north on the route to where Michael is in Calgary, Alberta, Edmonton, they argue they had the oldest Gurdwara, like in the 1880s and 1890s. And I've seen a telegram of a Sikh man sending money back home to India in 1896 from Golden, BC, right? This telegram exists, and unfortunately somebody took it and is not giving it back. So there's no kind of, you know, way to analyze this document and archive. What that tells me is that we can't look to official understandings of history, government understandings of history, documented only understandings of history to understand our presence and permanency. And so I'm giving a long-winded answer to your really great question, but I absolutely look for Gurdwaras in terms of presence and Sikh identity. Let's look at the Nagar Kirtan too. I did a talk on the history of Nagar Kirtans in Vancouver, and there's this iconic image of the first Sikh procession in 1904 in Vancouver. It's this iconic image. That wasn't a Nagar Kirtan because the Guru Granth Sahib Ji wasn't there, right? What makes it a Nagar Kirtan is the presence of the Guru Granth Sahib Ji. And that too is a part of that self-identity, self-awareness of what does it take to make a sacred space, a Sikh sacred space, a Gurdwara. It's the Guru Granth Sahib Ji. And the Nagar Kirtan from that moment on, after 1904, becomes a part of Sikh history, Sikh diaspora history as well. So Gurdwaras are a part of that history, the Guru Granth Sahib Ji, Sikh identity awareness building, and then bringing us to today to those amazing questions you asked about what is the role of Gurdwara spaces. I can be super critical of what's not happening in Gurdwara spaces, right, in terms of gender, in terms of caste, in terms of many, many different things. But when the pandemic happened, I know Gurdwaras here stepped up like never before. Our community started paying for their own helicopters to send food during flood crises in British Columbia, right? This comes out of the rallying in Gurdwara spaces, the Sanghats coming together to say, let's do this ourselves because nobody else is going to do it for us. And so there's beauty within that too, but it doesn't mean we don't critique and we don't analyze and we don't evolve going forward as well. So that's my very long-winded answer to your great question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And then adding to that, I mean, in the U.S. context, when we talk about the Gurdwara, most commonly it's referred to as a Sikh place of worship or a Sikh temple. And this has become the common understanding amongst the general public and even amongst Sikh American advocacy groups, some even Sikh American scholars. And by doing so, we are stripping away the political, the social, cultural, educational importance of the Gurdwara itself. And no one is doing that besides us when we say Sikh temple or Sikh place of worship, because it's not just a religious space, which was your question, Tavleen, right? Like, there's so much more happening than just Path and Kirtan and Katha, right? Like, that's not the only thing that happens in the Gurdwara. In US, again, as it was mentioned, I think Dr. Tillon was mentioning yesterday, when the COVID pandemic hit, Riverside Gurdwara became a space where the community could mobilize and give meals to the general public. Same thing was happening in Gurdwaras across the US. And when natural disasters happens, Gurdwaras are the space where they organize. And again, organize for many different aspects. So, and it's the reason why I always try to use Sikh institution rather than Sikh place of worship or Sikh temple, but even Sikh institution, I always try to say like Sikh political, social, cultural, educational, and religious institution. It becomes long-winded, but that's the best way to describe Gurdwara. Because when we're talking about religious spaces, people know what a mandir is, people know what a masjid is, people know what a synagogue is, but we feel it necessary to say a Gurdwara is a Sikh temple. We're diminishing it ourselves by saying it's a Sikh temple. Why can't, if they can learn masjid, synagogue and all that, why can't they learn Gurdwara? Because when we say Gurdwara, they need to understand that it's not just a place of worship, and it's much more than that.
Yeah, and in pioneering context, Gurdwaras were where people stayed.
Yeah.
The Baksa in Shepherd's Bush in England, in Singh Sabha.
Yeah.
I mean, it was simply, in the diaspora, the Gurdwara functioned in a very multifaceted way.
Even if we want to look at Ghan Singh Naba's definition of Gurdwara, he goes beyond just a religious aspect of it. So.
I see a question in the very back.
I'll get around. I'll never translate it when I teach.
Can we have a question here and then I'll make my way back?
Sure, I don't see the one here.
Right
It's
here.
you.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Thank you so much for a wonderful panel. I think my question is centered on themes that all three of you talked about, but particularly about when we think about in the Sikh community and in Sikh narratives about who tells history. How do we be cognizant and mindful of kind of like what you were talking about, Dr. Sandhra, about caste, gender, low-class Sikhs whose stories and voices are not necessarily heard within the diaspora, given that there is positionalities of power and people who have more voice within Sikh communities. How do we make sure that those stories and narratives are told? And then kind of in tandem with that, when we're doing outreach in terms of making this scholarship and academia part of the community, how do we make sure that it's accessible to those folks as well, whether that be through the rhetoric we're using, the language and that barrier, things like that? How do we make sure that those things aren't blind spots as well?
Mentorship. Mentorship is so important. And I'm really cognizant of when I use the word mentorship because I feel like people weaponize it and just use it to the point it becomes empty. So when I say mentorship, I mean as a Sikh woman who is the first Sikh to graduate in the history department in her PhD at UBC, I will volunteer my time wherever I can to talk to other young people who want to enter the discipline, who are interested in archives and public history and museums and documentary work, anything and everything I will do to talk to young people to say this field is for you, because too many times I keep being told I don't belong. I started a new job at Parks Canada, which is a federal government job. Just last week, a white woman told me that, she doesn't think I belong and that I'm taking too long to learn the bureaucratic system. And it's like, well, no shit, right? Like, I don't belong because my identity, what I bring into a space when I come into a space is so the antithesis to what your bureaucracy is used to, what your way of being, what your academia, what your everything. Of course I'm going to be totally different. We need more people like that who are just so brutally true to who they are. They enter a space and they're unapologetically them because we are taught in these spaces and systems to be a certain way. So mentorship is so important, and I will joyfully give my time to mentor anybody and everyone who wants it.
Good. Tejpaul, Michael.
I'll address the part of your question we're talking about accessible to the knowledge being accessible to the public. And in this scholarly space that we're in right now, we need to understand there's a specific audience who will read the papers that are being published and the books that are being published within this space, and those who won't. And then even with the museum exhibit that we're talking about, the San Joaquin County Museum has its own publication. And that museum exhibit was translated into a publication as well, because there are those in the museum spaces who may not read the scholarly work, but will read something like this that is published by a established museum. And we need to understand there are many different audiences out there, and how do we really convert our scholarship into an accessible format where multiple audiences can understand it.
Yeah, and I think that multiplicity of voices, or multiplicity of narratives, and I think just being able to provide some space, whether that's digital space or scholarly space or mentored space, for all of those narratives to be told on their own terms. So allowing various Sanghats, I would reference, I'm working with one particular Gurdwara, and they are using some of the stuff that I found in the archive to tell their own story of their Sanghat, of their community, of their Gurdwara. We can take this to other Gurdwaras and they can do the same thing, and it's not going to be the same story. So that's another way to do it.
Okay. Doris, take the microphone over to...
Van has a question, and then next.
Oh, okay, Van.
I was just going to ask Tejpaul about Gurdwara, and certainly I agree Gurdwaras are much more than some people think, and I agree temple is a terrible term for it, but I'd push back a little against place of worship, and you seem to be making a distinction that kirtan and katha is worship, and that somehow seva and the politics and all that goes on in the Gurdwara aren't, and you're buying into a distinction that I think you might want to question. Isn't the Gurdwara is the door to the Guru, and service to the Guru includes all of that seva and all that miri piri and all that stuff that comes out of the Gurdwara. So maybe you don't need to give up with place of worship. You just need to let people know that Sikhs are worshiping when they're the Guru, when they're engaging in these other things that take place in a Gurdwara space. Interested in your response to that?
So like seva as a means of worship as well. I think it's more so when we completely agree with you, and I'm thinking about it now as well. We'll definitely think about it more, but it's also when we say place of worship, the general public, they don't see worship as beyond worship. So again, as mentioned, like there's multiple audiences that we can speak to, right? This audience may understand like, yeah, seva as worship. We can see that. I go into a classroom of 9th and 10th graders, seva as worship, and might go right over their head. So really understanding and speaking to the Sanghats and the audiences in their terms. But valid point.
It's that liberal framing
So,
as well, that there is the religion.
Whoever has the microphone, go ahead.
Thank you so much for the panel. I really appreciated all the presentations. And
We can't hear you.
It's working. I don't think it's working.
Is it working? No, it's just recording for the video.
Oh, I see.
But so just speak into it and speak loudly.
Okay, thank you for the presentations. So I wanted to touch base a little bit on the tensions between scholarly work and whatever we're calling community work, advocacy work, et cetera, right? So in my own engagement with thinking about the university and critical university work, and also being in my position and thinking about Sikh studies, I'm very much invested in doing this thing of like breaking down the binaries between scholarly work, community knowledge production, thinking about community members as knowledge producers in themselves, and activist work. And the university itself is like supposedly very committed to doing community work through a discourse of diversity and really wanting to fund and support community engaged work. But at the same time, I'd love to hear from you, maybe both or all three of you, about what are some of the actual, like, how do you map power in terms of, your structural position in the university, and what are the actual challenges to doing this? Is it just a matter of being strategic and deciding, okay, I'm not going to focus on my scholarly work and I'm just going to put more energy into community stuff? Or is that kind of the critique, or do we actually have to think more strategically about negotiating university and community spaces? Because I'm constantly doing this as well, so I'm thinking, for my Sikh Studies curriculum now, like, is there a way I can plug that into Orange County Ethnic Studies curriculum? Or is there a way I can have my students in Sikh Studies start plugging into the work that you're doing, Tejpaul? Where do we aim our critiques? What is structural about it? What is it just something that we need to focus on individually? And how are you thinking about negotiating these spaces?
We're waiting.
Sharon, did you hear that?
We're having one final question after the answer is
question?
here.
Yes.
I did, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Does someone want to start? Sure.
I mean, I can start, or Michael can start, because you haven't answered in a while, Michael.
Okay, no, fair enough. Yeah, this is something that I think any of us who are working sort of in this area need to kind of wrestle with. I'm very fortunate at the university where I work that there is a great deal of support for activist work as scholarship, and it's I could say a lot of critiques about my university and bureaucracy and whatnot, but that's one of the things that I think they do very well at, and they recognize activism about working with exhibits and working with communities as part of research. So that part I'm fairly comfortable with at my university, and have, I think, less of a height of a hurdle to cross than others working in more so-called traditional research institutions. Where I struggle with this is, again, things about ownership and property of the work that I'm doing, and having that reside only in a university setting. And I have been very, very cognizant since the beginning of this to separate as much as I possibly can the work that I do from the rights of the university. We can shut the camera off now. For example, for example, I ensure that I am paying out of pocket for all of the web hosting, for all of the ArcGIS work, for all of these subscriptions, so that they can be transferred later to community organizations and community ownership, rather than remaining housed in the university. When I do interviews, it is done under the auspices of Mount Royal University, but the release and the intellectual property is assigned over to me personally, not to the university. So I've been very clear about trying to make some of those separations. Camera can come back on now. Sharon?
I love questions about activism, because that's something I'm very passionate about. And I've learned over the past few years that we have to accept a spectrum of activism. So Michael is talking about this incredible work he's doing about kind of subverting the bureaucracies within the university academic setting. My spectrum is to simply call out. And for better or for worse, I am not liked because of it or liked because of it. That is the spectrum I have chosen, right? I will call out institutions publicly. I will call out colleagues publicly. I personally just don't have the time or energy to engage in the politics of academia. And I don't mentally have the capacity to do that. So my spectrum is to simply call out. I will publish and do op-eds, and it works for me, right? Because I do think we need to somehow find our power in the margins. So we often see, bell hooks as concept, right? We often see the margins as this space of less power. But what if we flip that and totally find our positionality with each other in the work that we do in those very margins? Create our solidarity, create our resistances, and don't work within the boxes that keep us stymied in so many ways. So my answer to your question around, how do we challenge, is to find our positionality within that spectrum, be comfortable with it, continue with it. And the challenges, I could go on and on about challenges and we don't have time. So that's another conversation.
Okay.
For me, I'll second what Michael and Sharon had to say. 100% agree with what both of them had to say, but I want to address, you were talking about, what does it look like? Are we not going to do our scholarly work so we can focus more on community work? And my philosophy is, why can't they both be the same? Again, my research allows me to gain this knowledge and gain this understanding of Sikh American history, and there's many practical applications to that. For example, as I mentioned, designating historic landmarks and building up an archive, creating curricula. That's a practical application of the scholarly work that I have done. And then also I want to mention like the issue of ownership that Michael was referring to. It's an issue that we're seeing here in California as well. For those who may be familiar, UC Davis has an archive, the UC Davis Punjabi Pioneering Archives. Right. That archive was originally started by Ted Sibia as the Sikh Pioneers Archive. Right. And he gave the work to the university with the understanding that the university will respect the work and respect the voice of the community. Rather, after his passing, they took all of his work from Sikh Pioneers and pretty much ran that to the ground, and now it's UC Davis Punjabi Pioneering Archives, or whatever the official title is. And his wife is now advocating to either have UC Davis do a better job and ensure that the community is involved with that archive, or just to completely take that back from the university. Because there is that sense of gatekeeping within the university structure. So again, the issue of ownership is one thing that's huge when talking about the community and talking about who has access to what.
Very good. We have one, no. We are actually finished. It is time to take a break. I just have a question. Were there no Punjabi Muslims in the Alberta area?
Not that I know of.
Thank you.
They came from Turkey and Syria.
And you
in the
know
30s.
so much,
Yeah.
so I'm sure you're right.